Move on then to Southport and the issue of the prosecution there and the guilty verdict, the guilty plea, actually.
Guilty plea, indeed. Yeah, this goes back to the events from the summer 2024 and the recent trial of Axel Rudakubana. And first of all, we start with a note posted by the Attorney General with echoes of what was happening in the summer, as to what people should post on the internet. Of course, many people at that time falling foul of public order and online safety legislation, but the Crown Prosecution Service here confirming that the teenager, Rudakubana, 18 years old, has pleaded guilty to 3 charges of murder, 10 of attempted murder, the production of ricin, and the ownership of what is being described as a terror manual. Now, the response from the Prime Minister has been to use this as a tool with which to extract the maximum political capital and, of course, further justification for censorship and surveillance and the criminalisation of dissent. Now, he spoke yesterday about this, and having fought off calls for an inquiry into child abuse, he is now going to put in motion an inquiry into the events surrounding the murder of 3 young girls in Southport in the summer. This is how he introduced the topic.
The tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those 3 young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. In pursuit of that, we must, of course, ask and answer difficult questions. Questions that should be far-reaching, unburdened by cultural or institutional sensitivities, and driven only by the pursuit of justice. That is what we owe the family.
So whilst he mentions change, what he really means is progressing the narrative that was developed by the previous Conservative administration, in particular the ever-broadening definition of extremism, which, of course, UK Column has covered over the last few months. Now, in reframing people as extremist and thereby causing enormous division and mistrust in society, he's really demonstrating that the administration, his regime, has lost control, and this continued focus on extremism has really just been confected in order to conflate it with terrorism. So, taking the opportunity, he has pushed forward this narrative specifically with regard to terrorism, and here he is explaining exactly how that works out.
Nonetheless, it is now time for those questions. And the first of those is whether this was a terrorist attack. The blunt truth here is that this case is a sign. Britain now faces a new threat. Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety, sometimes inspired by traditional terrorist groups, but fixated on that extreme violence, seemingly for its own sake. Now, it may well be that people like this are harder to spot, but we can't shrug our shoulders and accept that. We can't have a national security system that fails to tackle people who are a danger to our values, our security, our children. We have to be ready to face every threat.
Of course, the reference to our values is something that needs much greater scrutiny, but will not be allowed under these circumstances. And of course, he points towards loners and misfits who are hard to spot. So he goes on to describe what it is he's going to do about this.
And when I look through the details of this case, the extreme nature of the violence, the meticulous plan to attack young children in a place of joy and safety, violence clearly intended to terrorise, then I understand why people wonder what the word terrorism means. And so if the law needs to change to recognise this new and dangerous threat, then we will change it, and quickly. And we will also review our entire counter-extremist system to make sure we have what we need to defeat it. Now, that work is already underway. I've tasked Sir David Anderson Casey, the new Independent Prevent Commissioner, to hold this system to account, to shine a light into its darkest corners, so the British people can have confidence that action will follow words.
This, of course, has nothing to do with holding the system to account, but everything to do with producing new tools with which to clamp down on those that are deemed to be speaking out or doing things that are not meeting the approval of the state. Also worth pointing out, the reworking of the definition of terrorism is a way in which the government may remove itself from the crosshairs. Of course, the UK column talking for well over a year about the very close proximity between the government's actions and the definition of terrorism as given by the Terrorism Act 2000. And this also may well serve to undermine the processes of tax resistance, as demonstrated by people like Chris Coverdale, who've been interviewed for UK column. Now, the way he speaks, it's as though, and this is a consistent theme, he's still in his role as Director of Public Prosecutions, and he lost no time in rewriting history and explaining all the good things he did whilst he was in that job. And this gave him cause to speak about the way in which he was not going to release evidence earlier on for fear of prejudicing the case. In fact, the doubling down on this particular issue has been such that the CPS have produced another statement out today to make exactly that point. Now, that, of course, is tantamount to a barefaced lie, because the production of ricin, which is now down as an offence that has been pled guilty to, should have been immediately obvious, would have been immediately obvious, and details of that were released prior to the trial, but certainly not at the time of arrest. That discrepancy has not been explained satisfactorily at all. Also, in his speech, he has almost suggested that had it not been possible to buy knives on the internet, then this might not have happened. Of course, the push here is to exploit the plight of these families, and in particular the deaths of young children, in order to further the ends and goals of the Online Safety Act 2023, which is due for significant upgrading as a result of this. Also, to push further the Labour policy on knife crime. They've already stated that they intend to halve knife crime, but of course not eliminate it altogether, strangely enough. And also, just on the online theme, the already a suggestion that there might be two-step verification. So we're looking at digital ID, presumably at a bare minimum, but also the use of a webcam with which to verify that you are not, in fact, a child. It's almost as though he has not heard of artificial intelligence. So this is looking very much like a tool for further online safety, and especially, as I say, exploiting the harm to these children. In a sort of oblique reference, he also said, lamenting the state of affairs in the country, that children have stopped going to school and young people have opted out of work or education. He is trying to make the shoe fit by describing loners and misfits, but actually what he's talking about really are the hangover effects of the COVID policy, thereby people turning away from state education and indeed probably being unfit for work, as demonstrated by all the statistics relating to economic inactivity. Now, it referred to, again, also as the failure of prevent. So we can see the likelihood that there will be far more engagement between prevent and young people meddling in schools, again, documented by UK Column in a very good interview with Debbie Evans from last year. And he concludes his, ramblings, for want of a better word, by saying that nothing will be off the table in this inquiry, nothing. So we'll wait and see and mark him against that statement. Now, I want to come on to the BBC's part in all of this, because they have taken a role that has been entirely central to developing this narrative, without which it's hard to see that the public would be effectively conditioned to the point of being able to accept what is going to happen and indeed what has happened, because by extraordinary coincidence, there has been a recent release of a BBC documentary into what they're describing as racism within the group Patriotic Alternative, which is described, of course, always by the BBC as being a far-right group. We've spoken about it a lot before on UK Column. They are self-described as being ethno-nationalists, and there has never been any suggestion that there is a link between Patriotic Alternative and terrorism, and yet they now find themselves falling under that same microscope. Mark Collett, the leader of Patriotic Alternative, did make his own recording, which, of course, he counters by saying that he, therefore, has exposed the BBC. But the point to draw out here is that this is being used as a way of calling for Patriotic Alternative, among others, to be prescribed. And we'll come on to the context of that. But to quote from the article, they say that the group cannot be banned under current legislation, as they do not advocate terrorism. But Dame Sarah, talking about Dame Sarah Khan, the former UK's counter-extremism commissioner, feels that they are creating a climate conducive to terrorism. Now, this goes back, courtesy of the BBC, to early 2024, when Michael Gove named, again, among others, but Patriotic Alternative, and the article at that time said that the new extremism definition applies to, but does not criminalise, groups promoting an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance. Now, this is rather clear to see what the direction of travel is. But in terms of context, whilst the BBC may indeed have recorded certain remarks of certain people who have an affiliation or an association with Patriotic Alternative, although Mark Collett was very keen to make the point that this was not during formal meetings, and therefore they were not said in public, and therefore did not constitute criminal events. But this is the way Patriotic Alternative have been treated. Now, in the summer, when the Labour councillor Ricky Jones was recorded as saying they are disgusting Nazi fascists and we need to cut their throats and get rid of them all, I don't think anybody suggested that the Labour Party should be prescribed because of his association with it. Now, just as an aside, we had the prescription announced last week of Hizb ut-Tahrir, described as being the right thing to do in the House of Lords for reasons of our national security. Now, this was on the specific grounds of their anti-Semitism as a group. Now, into the realms of hypocrisy we go, because the prescription of Al-Qaeda back in March 2001 made specific reference to the group now operating in Syria with its hand on the tiller, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and it says here that it should be treated as an alternative name for the organisation, which is already prescribed under the name Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, of course, being referred to by Starmer. And yet here we see the BBC, Jeremy Bowen alongside the rebranded leader Jelani, very much being promoted. Now, under, as referenced by Mike previously, under the Terrorism Act 2000, this really should constitute an offence because it is for the benefit of a prescribed organisation, which is very specifically prohibited by that piece of legislation. So Starmer's speech will have far-reaching ramifications, certainly in terms of legislative upheaval, censorship and surveillance, and it's therefore up to us to make sure that these changes are used as a means of exposing the government's agenda and the further extinction of liberty.